Xylar fidgeted with a datapad in his spindly hands, the flight recorder's disembodied voice intoning planetary data over the comm system. Earth, Sol system. Oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere. Estimated gravity's a 98 standard. Primary biosphere, carbon-based. Primary biosphere deceptively hospitable, Xylar muttered under his breath, adding his own notes. He was a xenozoologist with a Galactic Concordance, well-versed in the harshest environments the galaxy had to offer. Earth, with its quaint designation as a Class 12 world, was supposed to be an easy assignment. After all, it was the origin world of those peculiar, soft-fleshed creatures called humans, a species surprisingly adaptable, but hardly the stuff of nightmares. Or so the report said. Xylar had his doubts. Any place that spawned something capable of both interplanetary travel and inventing something called Vegemite had to harbor some hidden, terrifying potential. The sleek Concordance cruiser slipped into orbit, and Xylar's segmented eyes widened at the viewscreen. Below, instead of the charred wasteland or toxic swamps he'd imagined, there sprawled a vision of blue and green so startling it seemed almost gentle. "Welcome to Earth, mate," chirped an accented voice as he disembarked. A human, built deceptively sturdy under a deceptively cheerful smile, extended a hand in greeting. "Steve Irwin's the name, park ranger, and your certified Aussie guide." His other hand held a wide-brimmed hat perched atop a mop of sun-bleached hair. Xylar shook the proffered appendage gingerly, noting calluses that spoke of a life lived far from climate-controlled labs. "Zoologist Xylar of the Concordance. I am here to finalize Earth's official threat classification." Steve's grin widened. "Right then, better get cracking. Crikey, we've got ourselves some beasties to show ya." The first hours of the excursion were an exercise in absurdity for Xylar. Earth's national park, meticulously manicured and suspiciously devoid of slavering megafauna, held all the danger of an algae culture, in his opinion. "And this," Steve declared, pointing to a furry brown creature lounging in a tree, "is a koala. Mostly sleeps. Give him a wide berth though, got some nasty claws for climbing." Xylar blinked, his multifaceted eyes focusing on the creature. He'd assumed they'd be starting with something impressive, not a nap enthusiast. His datapad buzzed insistently, displaying reports on Earth fauna: docile, herbivorous, approximately zoothreat probability. He suppressed a sigh. "Next then," Steve chirped, already striding ahead. Xylar hurried to keep up, dodging a creature that looked alarmingly like a fur-covered sausage, and which, according to Steve, harbored a gland secreting a pungent, eye-watering musk. "Is there anything on your planet that doesn't aim to either maim or inconvenience me?" Xylar demanded, his voice rising in frustration. Steve paused, taking the question literally. Then the grin returned, wider than ever. "See those red fellas over yonder? Those are kangaroos. They'll leave you be less you start something. Though I did see a bloke get boxed by one once, kicked his esky clean open." The ranger mimed a swift uppercut, followed by an explosion of stubbies flying through the air. "An esky is a," Xylar began, his head throbbing as he tried to parse the alien slang. "Cooler. For drinks," Steve clarified, then pointed off into the distance. "Now, 'bout time you met something interestin'. Little fella just round the corner'll curl your toes, he will." Part of Xylar dared to hope this promised some genuine challenge worthy of a full zoological workup. Maybe something with fangs or multiple stingers or acid for blood. The creature around the corner was nestled by a tree root. It was about the size of his hand, glossy black, and possessed too many legs for Xylar's liking. "Redback spider," Steve announced. "One bite, your day is done, maybe even the rest of your life, if you're unlucky." Xylar's antennae twitched in alarm. Finally, something appropriately horrifying. He inched closer for a better look. Steve flicked the spider off his shoulder with a nonchalance that made Xylar's chitin crawl. "Just keep an eye out, they tend to get into boots and stuff." By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon of this bafflingly serene wilderness, Xylar's preconceptions of a Deathworld were thoroughly shattered. The deadliest thing he'd encountered could be squished underfoot if he were so recklessly inclined. This was Not what I expected, he admitted begrudgingly, settling cross-legged next to a crackling campfire built with an ease that made his own botched attempts earlier that day seem all the more humiliating. That why they call it the bush, mate. Steve settled opposite him with a can of some fizzing beverage, whose label hinted it was both neon-colored and lethal for most known species in the Concordance. Full of surprises. The shadows lengthened, and unfamiliar animal calls pierced the deepening twilight screeches, hoots, and what sounded like maniacal laughter. Xylar resisted the urge to flinch with every unidentifiable noise. "Don't tell me those are the predators I've been waiting for," he muttered, the campfire seeming less reassuring by the second. "Nah, probably just possums getting frisky or some kookaburras. Nothing here's gonna drag you off in the night, promise." Steve's calm only emphasized the sheer strangeness of Earth's ecosystem. Predators that didn't bother to hunt? That seemed a bit evolutionarily lax. "Unless you count drop bears," he added, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Drop bears," Xylar echoed. His translator was already struggling to parse Steve's bizarre vocabulary. "Big, vicious fellas. Hide in trees, wait for something to walk under," Steve trailed off, gesturing upwards theatrically. An uneasy prickle ran down Xylar's carapace. His compound eyes scanned the canopy, a sixth sense screaming at him despite the absurdity of the image. "You're jesting," he finally concluded, though there was a tremor to his voice he couldn't quite conceal. Steve just grinned and took another swig of his alarmingly colored drink. "Maybe, but hey, best to stay alert on Earth. Just when you think you've got it figured, she'll surprise ya." As night fully descended, the chorus of sounds amplifying into a full-blown symphony of the bizarre, Xylar found sleep an impossible luxury. Just when he was convinced a snuffling sound heralded his imminent demise, Steve would yawn and mutter something about roos or wombats. It became clear the fauna, though undeniably strange, were the least of his worries. This planet, he was beginning to suspect, had more subtle ways of breaking a xenozoologist. "This," Xylar declared, gesturing with increasing agitation at yet another deceptively ordinary body of water, "is a safe swimming spot?" Steve, clad in garish patterned shorts and liberally slathered in a substance allegedly meant to deter something called sunburn, surveyed the placidly shimmering billabong with a shrug. "Sure, why wouldn't it be?" Xylar rattled off a list gleaned from his datapad. Freshwater crocodiles with a documented bite force exceeding most Terran land predators. Paralyzing jellyfish. Platypus, they're venomous. Did you know that? "All blue there?" Steve pointed nonchalantly at a log-like shape sunning on the opposite bank. "He don't care about us. More interested in a duck, probably. Jellyfish, yeah, you gotta watch where you step out in the ocean. And duck-billed platypus." He chuckled. "They're quirky little critters, all right. But the spurs are mostly for the fellas fighting over a missus. We won't get in their way." The way the humans so effortlessly dismissed what Xylar classified as apex threats bordered on madness. "And that assumes nothing else is lurking beneath the surface," he hissed, mandibles twitching as he eyed ripples disturbing the stillness. "Well, there's fish and turtles," Steve offered. "Maybe a yabby if you're lucky." Xylar blinked. "A yabby?" "Freshwater crayfish. Good eating." "Eating?" he squeaked. Steve's grin stretched wider. "Look, mate, the point is, Earth ain't gonna try to kill you outright, mostly, but she expects you to know your stuff and keep your wits about you. It's subtle, see?" Xylar wasn't sure if he saw anything besides a testament to the sheer insanity of humanity. Yet, begrudgingly, he had to admit none of the creatures listed as lethal encounters in his reports had actually tried to consume him. Perhaps Earth's deadliness wasn't in its megafauna after all. Just then, a buzzing sound assailed his hearing appendages. A small, iridescent blur zoomed past his face. "What is that?" he squawked, swatting at the air in alarm. "Fly," Steve supplied unhelpfully. "Annoying little buggers." The fly, seemingly undeterred, made several more passes at his head. This was his breaking point. "Take me back to your ship," he demanded. "This planet is preposterous." The Concordance transport was a bastion of sanity. sterile, temperature-controlled, and blissfully devoid of any lurking, venomous, buzzing, or absurdly camouflaged threats. Yet Xylar couldn't shake the disquiet. He'd come seeking the stuff of nightmares, of creatures designed to horrify. Instead, he'd found a world that didn't bother. "Look, maybe the inland's got what you're after," Steve suggested, ever optimistic as he navigated them toward the burnt-orange heart of the continent. Outbacks where the true grit of Australia lies. Xylar narrowed his eyes. Grit? Do you mean that in the literal sense? I do recall reports of silicaceous dust being an environmental hazard. Steve chuckled. More, spirit, toughness. You'll see. And see he did. The outback was an assault on every sense. The sheer scale of the emptiness, the relentless heat baking the landscape into a shimmering mirage, it made his chitin prickle and his thorax tighten. The transport's air filters hummed in protest, choked by the ever-present dust. "This," he announced grimly, feeling moisture evaporate from his skin almost instantly, "is certainly inhospitable." Steve, inexplicably, seemed delighted. "That's the spirit. Now, keep your eyes peeled. Lots of beasties thrive out here. Gotta be tough to do it." The first creature they encountered was a thorny lizard, or rather, a spiked miniature dragon, judging by its appearance, puffing itself up in a desperate attempt at looking intimidating. Xylar made a hasty note, fascinated. This was better. This was the hardiness his reports had promised. Then Steve got the transport hopelessly bogged in a dune, forcing them to abandon the safety of its climate control. As night fell and the temperature plummeted, Xylar found himself huddled pathetically around the campfire Steve had constructed with, once again, infuriating ease. "I will never survive this," he moaned, the words echoing the vast emptiness surrounding them. "Quit your whinging, you'll be right," Steve countered, digging into a backpack to produce foil-wrapped packets. "Here, have a snag." "Eh? Snag?" Xylar echoed warily. Everything about this planet was bewildering. "Sausage. Tucker for the soul," Steve declared, tossing one onto the glowing coals. Xylar watched, perplexed, as it sizzled. Technically, it was edible. It would sustain him. But the thrill of discovery, the adrenaline of outwitting a truly dangerous world, those were missing. And perhaps, somewhere in the farthest reaches of his xenozoologist brain, the realization dawned. Earth wasn't about to serve him up its horrors on a silver platter. They were baked into the landscape itself. "You realize," Xylar said, the words emerging a bit grumpily after gnawing on what may or may not have been genuine snag, "this planet is actively trying to murder me. This sun. This thirst." Steve, maddeningly comfortable cross-legged on the scorched ground, merely shrugged. "She's a harsh mistress, that's for sure, but predictable once you know her. Water's the key." He uncapped a battered water bottle, taking a swig. Predictable? Xylar would debate that. Yet he felt his focus shifting. Instead of fixating on the next potential predator, he was acutely aware of his own bodily signals, the persistent dryness of his throat, the ache in his foot joints from unaccustomed exertion, the growing fuzziness of his thoughts from lack of hydration, was it? Hours later, as they trekked across cracked red earth, Steve paused. "See that?" He gestured towards a deceptively ordinary stand of mulga scrub. Xylar saw only spindly trees and the ever-present dust. "See what?" "No, feel it." He hesitantly extended a limb, brushing against the bark. It felt odd, almost spongy. Steve produced a knife, and with the ease of long practice, sliced into the trunk. Water wept from the cut. "What is this sorcery?" Xylar breathed, a thrill of genuine discovery sparking through him. "Survival," Steve replied. "Animals know it. Some of the old Aboriginal folks still know how to find it. Takes time and know-how. That's the thing about Earth, mate. She ain't gonna hand you nothing on a plate." It suddenly struck Xylar, the wildlife reports. They'd focused on the flashy dangers, the spiders and snakes. But here it was the relentless basics that were a threat. This planet wore its dangers on the outside, leaving no energy, no resources to be wasted on theatrical displays of aggression. "I must commend this ecosystem," he said slowly, something like grudging respect creeping into his voice. "It fosters efficiency." Nah, she fosters toughness, Steve countered. See that little Sheila? He pointed to a scraggly plant, seemingly on the verge of death. After a rain, blooms brighter than any fancy flower you got in a lab. That's the trick life here, it hangs on. Perhaps Earth was no Deathworld in the traditional sense, Xylar mused. Perhaps that was the entire point. The climax of Xylar's outback adventure was undeniably less than glamorous. 2 days in, a swarm of relentless flies and the relentless throbbing behind his eyeballs finally drove him over the edge. Enough, he declared, slapping at the buzzing cloud tormenting his face. I concede, Earth is, I admit, a formidable environment. But your incessant insects are an evolutionary absurdity. Steve, who thus far had cheerfully endured Xylar's near-constant complaints, eyed him with concern. You all right there, mate? You look a bit crook. Crook, Xylar echoed, his voice rising in both pitch and volume. I am dehydrated, sunburned, and covered in enough insect bites to trigger an interspecies plague. Take me back to your ship and let me file my damning report. Steve, instead of showing an ounce of alarm, merely dug around in his backpack. Hold your horses. Here, have some of this. He offered a canteen and Xylar snatched it, draining half the contents with undignified haste. Sweet, cool relief flooded his system. He felt lightheaded. Easy there, Tiger, Steve chided. And here. He produced a tube of something white and viscous. Slap this on your burns, take the edge off. Grudgingly, Xylar obeyed. The goo, while smelling faintly medicinal, did bring a modicum of soothing coolness to his overheated skin. See, Earth'll kill ya. Slow like if you don't respect her, Steve stated matter-of-factly. It's the little things that get ya. The flies returned with a vengeance, and something in Xylar simply snapped. Instead of fleeing, he whirled on them, a strangled cry echoing across the desolate landscape as he swatted and flailed. Even the ever-present dingo howls in the distance seemed to pause out of sheer bewilderment. When the outburst subsided, he collapsed onto a rock, too exhausted to even care about maintaining his dignity. Steve ambled over, a hint of amusement in his eyes. You know, he said casually, there's these hats with nets. Xylar let out a groan that might have been mistaken for a wounded animal, burying his face in his hands. This planet was going to be the death of his sanity, if not his body. The outback night was like nothing Xylar had ever experienced. Gone was the gentle symphony of the national park here. There was an edge to the noises. The eerie howl of dingoes not so distant anymore, the unsettling rustle of something moving in the darkness, and the maddening hum of insects that seemed to pierce directly into his brain. He huddled by the fire Steve insisted on keeping ablaze, despite the heat. Sleep was impossible, each crackling twig making him jump. What sort of lunatic felt safe in this environment? Relax, mate, Steve murmured, stretched out on a sleeping bag like he was stargazing on his own comfortable cruiser. You're scaring off any beasties that might have wandered in. Xylar narrowed his eyes. Are you implying I am making too much noise? Nah, reckon it's the smell of fear. Steve grinned, then his expression turned oddly serious. But really, Earth at night, that's when you feel it. Smallness ain't the right word. Humbleness, maybe? Big old sky, more stars than you can count. He gestured upwards. Xylar reluctantly followed his gaze. His compound eyes, more attuned to movement than celestial patterns, blinked in astonishment. The view was breathtaking was too soft a word. It was immense, crushing, and the unsettling realization hit him most of his civilized life had been spent inside climate-controlled habitats under artificial lights. Deathworlds are supposed to make you feel hunted, he said, almost to himself. This is different. It was vast indifference that pressed down on him, a reminder that the universe went on with or without his existence. Earth, specifically. You get used to it, Steve replied, or it'll spit you out. The night wore on, each shadowy shift of the landscape making his antennae twitch. Yet none of the monstrous predators his reports had hinted at materialized. It was, he realized with a jolt, his own imagination filling in the terrors. Hours later, as the first hint of dawn tinged the horizon, Xylar found himself blinking back sleep, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. He'd made it. "Well, I'm still alive," he muttered, more to himself than to Steve, who was somehow already brewing something over a fire that looked like it had been conjured from twigs and dry grass. "That's a start," Steve offered, handing him a chipped mug of steaming, bitter liquid. Xylar took a tentative sip and coughed. "Coffee. Wake you right up, it will." It tasted like concentrated darkness, but a flicker of something like defiance sparked in Xylar's thorax. He'd survived the outback. Maybe, just maybe, he'd survived this whole ridiculous planet. The following morning held a bizarre discovery. As Steve packed up, chattering idly about emus and gibber planes, Xylar spotted something nestled among the rocks. A small, furry creature with a leathery snout, beady eyes, and spines rather than fur. It was snuffling along, apparently oblivious to their presence. "What is that?" he asked, his voice hushed in a mix of awe and revulsion. Steve glanced up. "Echidna. Cute little buggers, aren't they?" "Cute?" Xylar stared at the creature. It looked like an improbable experiment in evolution, a mammal that had decided to borrow heavily from both the reptile and avian lineages. "They dig out ants," Steve continued, apparently not sensing Xylar's internal turmoil. "Got claws like shovels on those front paws. Spikes for when they feel threatened, just curl up into a ball. Amazing little survivors." The word stuck in Xylar's mind. Survivors. He watched the echidna, so perfectly adapted yet so utterly bizarre. That perhaps was the heart of it. Earth's brand of danger wasn't in razor-sharp teeth or mind-altering toxins, though it had those too. It was in the relentless necessity to adapt, the uncompromising demand to fit into its harsh symphony or be silenced. "I must study this more," he declared, retrieving his datapad eagerly. "Knock yourself out, mate," Steve shrugged, the ever-present grin back in place. "Always more critters to find out here." Hours later, as they trekked back towards the transport, Xylar was startled by a loud snort and a shadow detaching itself from a stand of scrub. His first instinct was alarm, but then he recognized the large bird with powerful legs and beady eyes regarding them warily. "Cassowary," Steve said casually, then paused meaningfully. "Now those, best to keep a distance. Got a kick strong enough to disembowel a man and claws. Well, wouldn't want to be on the receiving end, put it that way." A shiver ran down Xylar's carapace. Finally, a creature that fit the standard mold of a Deathworld denizen. But he'd been fixated on the wrong things, hadn't he? Perhaps its unusual territorial aggression is a response to habitat loss, he mused aloud. Or perhaps competition for limited resources. The human beside him just chuckled, resuming their walk. Xylar hurried to catch up. Earth had reframed his entire perspective, a humbling, strangely exhilarating experience. He had a feeling the Galactic Concordance was in for a rather surprising report. The transport back to Sydney wasn't the sweet relief Xylar had envisioned days ago. Each rumble of the engine, each jolt as they navigated rough terrain, wasn't an annoyance, but a jarring contrast to Steve's easy rhythm as they traversed the same landscape with deceptively little technology. "You might have started off thinking we're backwards," Steve said, startling Xylar from his ruminations. "No fancy suits, no hovercraft." "I was mistaken," Xylar admitted. "Earth. Its danger is less apparent, but perhaps more potent for its subtlety." "It's about know-how," Steve elaborated. "The planet forces you to respect her, or she breaks you, slow and sure, and—" He hesitated. "Thing is, something breaks in most people out there. Then they come back stronger. Something to do with that big empty sky, I reckon." Xylar considered this. In a galaxy obsessed with tech, with conquering planets that fought back, Earth seemed to demand an inward fight first against your own limits, your assumptions. Was that why humans, so physically unremarkable, had achieved so much? He spent the rest of the journey scribbling furiously on his datapad, deleting sections of his old report, adding new, complex analyses, environmental pressures as evolutionary drivers, behavioral adaptations masking underlying resilience, unusual emphasis on knowledge transfer over generations. It was a treatise unlike any he'd ever filed. Back in Sydney, the rush of urban life was oddly jarring after the outback. As his Concordance shuttle prepared to lift off, Steve sauntered over, shoving a crumpled paper bag into his hands. "Souvenir," he said with a wink. "Vegemite. For when you miss that taste of pure darkness." Xylar shuddered, but accepted it. Earth was nothing if not memorable. "Tell you what," Steve grinned as Xylar boarded the shuttle. "Come back sometime, and I'll take you out to the reef. Now there's some real critters with teeth." Xylar paused, a strange urge warring with sheer common sense. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "I shall." As his shuttle ascended, he took one last look at the deceptively tranquil blue marble below. Earth was, he decided, not a Deathworld by usual standards, but a paradox-class world. Harsh, subtle, fostering the most unlikely of creatures, those soft-skinned, relentless humans. And now, even one bewildered xenozoologist who'd learned far more about himself than about them. Xylar's report landed on the polished obsidian desk of the Galactic Concordance Grand Curator with less of a thud and more of a seismic tremor. His carefully constructed phrases and meticulously compiled evidence weren't met with bemusement as he expected, but with rising concern. "Paradox class?" echoed a high-pitched voice from a figure shrouded in flowing, iridescent robes. "A world that fosters strength through hidden struggle?" Xylar fidgeted, antennae twitching under the intent gazes around the polished table. "The environment forces rapid adaptation, behavioral as well as biological. Its species, including humans, have evolved obfuscation and resilience that belies their seeming ordinariness." Whispers broke out amongst the assembled dignitaries. Earth, that backwater of a planet, was suddenly the center of attention. This changes everything," murmured a tentacled being, its chromatophores shifting worriedly. "Humans, so outwardly unthreatening, yet capable of enduring extremes." "Are they a threat?" asked a booming voice, emanating from a towering reptilian figure. Xylar hesitated. "They could be, given the right stimuli, but I also observed a deep connection to their world. Their aggression stems from protecting that, not from a need to conquer others." A collective sigh rippled through the chamber. It was one thing to deal with a marauding species bent on galactic domination, but a world that bred quiet, adaptable survivors, that was far more unsettling. "We may need to re-evaluate our protocols," the Grand Curator decided. "Quarantine, perhaps, until we can better assess the situation." Xylar, remembering the endless horizons and peculiar creatures that fostered such unexpected tenets, felt a flicker of defiance. "I advise caution. Earth is not easily subdued, nor, perhaps, are its people." Back on Australia's sun-drenched shores, Steve sat on a weathered log, watching the waves crash. A faded postcard depicting a rather horrifying-looking spider landed in the sand next to him. He picked it up and grinned. "Thought you'd like to see this little beauty," the scrawling caption read. Beside him, a battered backpack sat open, a crumpled jar of Vegemite sticking out of one pouch. It wasn't much, but it was a symbol of a bond forged in a place where everything could kill you, and maybe, just maybe, that meant something in the grand scheme of the galaxy, though for the life of him he couldn't figure out what.